This time, no PowerPoints. It's unusual for me to give a talk without PowerPoints. It's sort of against my title, which is Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Electronic Education. People always ask me, what is electronic education? Well, part of it is I use technology, and I'm very into technology, and today I'm not going to, at least right now. I'm going to just talk, and I'm going to talk a little bit about just what my thoughts are, and disagree, agree, or don't, but I've been following on my white-collar crime blog for some time all the things that are going on and related to white-collar and corporate crime. And as I write the blog, sometimes twice a day and sometimes missing a day, I keep seeing the falling of our economy and wondering what's going to happen and how is it all going to come out in white-collar crime. And that's what I wanted to talk about. You know, Professor Baker started today talking about the term white-collar crime, a term that Edwin Sutherland back in 1939, when speaking to the American Sociological Society, started. And it always interested me when we talk about white-collar crime that initially the big, large law firms in the country didn't want anything to do with white-collar crime. If there was a criminal matter, they wanted it shipped out to some small firm outside or somebody who handled criminal law, but they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. And then we saw the next stage. They formed units within the large corporation. They called it special matters. These were special matters, and, well, we don't want to think of them quite as criminal, but they're special matters. And where are we today? Well, today I get announcements every week telling me about the white-collar crime practice of all the different law firms, who's joining them, who's leaving, and what's going on in these and they're all proud of it. The firms are all proud that they're handling white-collar crime matters. And I think that's an interesting thing to follow, to see how white-collar crime has sort of become an accepted area of the practice today. And the interesting thing will be is, where will it be down the road? So I'm going to talk about three things. First thing is accountability. The second thing is blame. And the third thing is transparency, or what I call the cause, accountability, the effect, blame, and the future, perhaps, transparency. There was a PBS nightly business report, and they quote Warren Buffett. And the quote was, "When the tide goes out, we see who's been swimming naked." And I think that's exactly what happened here. We've got, on the lack of accountability side, we've got the entire subprime market. We've got lax regulation. We've got a Department of Justice, and not to knock the Department of Justice in any way, but it's very true the resources went into terrorism, and the resources were not in white-collar crime for some period of time. The number of white-collar prosecutions went down if you follow the track recording system. Don't know that it went down quite as much as some people believe, but it did go down. The market started to fall, and people said there's no accountability here. And maybe there wasn't. And then we see also that there are different things happening, and I think that's the most important thing, and the thing I want to emphasize if you walk away with anything today from me, that you walk away with, and that is that we can't lump all of this financial crisis together. That there are many different types of criminal aspects out here, and we need to differentiate them. On one hand, we've got Ponzi schemes. And according to the National Law Journal this week, 19 alleged frauds of Ponzi scheme types in 2009 alone. And they were discussing how Madoff has plenty of company now. I think what's interesting is you had one come out, and of course when you have something large like that come out, everybody starts questioning their own portfolio. People start looking at, is it real or isn't it? And what unfolds is obviously going to be a lot of the smaller ones and some very large ones of Ponzi schemes, some still alleged, some guilty. But there were definitely Ponzi schemes out there. And when the tide went out, they were perhaps swimming naked. There was also another group of crimes, and that's corruption-type crimes. Very often occurring on the state level. I mean, I think back, this is nothing new. I'm in Chicago. I can think back of Grey Lord. I can think back of all of the different names of undercover operations in the United States, from Operation Bar Tab to Operation Corkscrew to Operation Roofers Union, to the many different ones where there have been undercover investigations very often on the state level. And that's a different type of crime. Then you have the aftermath of a financial crisis where people aren't at work, where people aren't going to commit more violent crimes, and most importantly, more thefts, because the aftermath of not having a job and not having a place is going to be an increase, most likely, in thefts. And then there's a final category, and that's the one that we've been talking about all day, and that's corporate fraud. And I think it's really important to distinguish that particular type of crime from the different types that I've mentioned previously. I don't think we can lump all of these together. Partially, I agree with Professor Ribstein that there is a certain amount of agency cost that we have to look at, but I also think that the mens rea is really important. When a person goes in to rob the bank, they know they are robbing a bank. When a person breaks into a house, they have the intent to commit that felony therein, taking of the property. But in many instances, we hear over and over again that some of the people who are allegedly committing the crimes, whether it be backdating or whether it be something else in the corporate sphere, that they just didn't know that it was wrong, or that they didn't know that somebody in the corporation who was doing it was doing this illegality. I'm hearing it too many times. I'm seeing it too many times. One begins to wonder when one hears something that many times that there's smoke, there's fire. Maybe there's something there. Maybe we aren't educating the corporate sphere enough. Or maybe we aren't making clear and simple exactly what the laws are and what the crimes are. So accountability, and when I speak of the lack of accountability in a subprime market with lax regulations, with prosecutions that may not have been looked at because terrorism was the focus, with the market falling, it's also important to look at the type of crime that's involved and to look at, did this individual really know that it was a crime? Was that mens rea really there? The second thing I want to talk about is blame, or the blame game. People want retribution. People have lost substantial funds, and I too listened to those hearings after Enron, and the stories were just devastating. People wanted relief. But we see that so often. I remember back when I tried murder cases. The victims, they wanted something. They wanted that relief. Congress reacts with new laws. I mean, we're going to see TARP developing. And TARP, by the way, has criminal authority. So we're going to see a whole vast amount of prosecutions that may come out as a result of the new legislation, or what I call the blame game. And there's existing laws that in many instances are very broad. Mail fraud. That's M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E. Honest services fraud with splintered jurisdictions out there, all holding its constitutional right now, but some not quite sure if they agree with the others on many aspects of the mail fraud statute. And after all, if a person is charged with a crime, do they really know that they committed mail fraud? You don't even need a mailing today as a result of the 1994 amendment that permits it through a non-mailing interstate carrier. I always wondered if somebody delivered pizza across the state lines and left off the extra cheese, if it could be a mail fraud. Because after all, if they do it continually and have a scheme to defraud, it would fit the statute. But we have these enormously broad statutes in mail fraud and wire fraud, and we also have statutes that are being used by prosecutors, what I call shortcut offenses. And you see them all the time: obstruction of justice, false statements, perjury, where they don't go after the actual conduct that the person might really have been committing, the fraud itself, but they use a shortcut offense in order to proceed quickly to that final resolution. All of that plays very well into the blame game. And then, of course, I think of Professor Baker's work on the vast number of existing federal laws out there. And then, up until recently, with some of the recent federal Supreme Court cases of Gall and Rita, we saw vast sentences. Sentences that many had never heard of before, like a 30-year sentence for a woman in Atlanta for a first-time offender on a mortgage fraud case. And one has to wonder, is this all part of the blame game, or is this in fact something that fits in with a lack of accountability? And finally, the last thing that I want to talk about is transparency. And I call that the future. Accountability, the cause; blame, the effect; and transparency, the future. I think what really needs to be done, as an academic, one gets to sit back and think about these things, but we really need to start educating companies and individuals within the companies a lot better than we have been. You know, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a very detailed act and difficult to understand, especially when you're extraterritorial and you're outside the United States. It's interesting that the vast number of deferred prosecution agreements come from Foreign Corrupt Practices Act case. We also need to stop thinking about this financial crisis and crime reactively, but start thinking about things proactively. And we have to realize that in this financial crisis, it's not going to just be the federal government. We've all been talking about the feds, but it's going to be the state. It's going to be the state attorney generals. It's going to be the state prosecutors that are going to get a lot of these cases. Because it's not only going to be the big corporations. That's all we tend to talk about, is the big corporations. But it's really going to be a lot of the small corporations and the smaller businesses that are really going to feel the brunt of this. And finally, I'd just like to say that the one thing that I think we do need to focus on a lot more, and maybe it's because I do electronic education, is internet fraud and credit card frauds. Because if not, we're going to be back here in a few years and we're going to be doing the same program, I have a feeling, and it's going to be on that. Thank you.